Hi everyone, today we're going to add to the colour focus section of the site. We've looked at some acrylic colours and now we're going to start to look at some watercolour colours. I have just got together my whole sort of set of reds, various brands, from Winsor & Newton to the SAA Zone, to this box of colours which is mainly white nights in here, although I did fill some of the gaps here with my old Winsor & Newtons. So as you can see, I'm using a combination of both pans and tubes, but I've decided to sort of group these together in terms of the batch of colours that I've got. I think it's good for you to sort of see the variation as we go through the reds, and as you can see they're into pinks and starting to come up to sort of lilacs and purples. So I've just drawn around a little credit card actually, just to give myself an area to work in. You don't have to worry about being tied to it, but all you're really doing is putting into that rectangle the concentrated colour towards the top, and then adding water into it to get a lighter tone of it, a lighter variation, until we're more or less just looking at water there stained with a little bit of the colour. With watercolour, to make a colour lighter, you add water to it. Very rarely do we add white to it. White is an opaque colour, and it's difficult then, if a colour is opaque, it's difficult for the white of the paper to come through. So you sort of lose the opportunity for the lightness of the paper to give you watercolours light and freshness. So you'll probably hear me say quite a bit the difference between using opaque colours and transparent colours. On the whole, I try to use transparent wherever I can, because I do like that lightness and that freshness to the colour, which you'll see as we go through this. So as I say, I've just done here a range of my reds, and noted at the top, just like we did with the acrylic book, what they are. So in this case, Winsor & Newton WN there. Winsor & Newton do two ranges. They do a Cotman range and then they do a professional artist range. It's probably worth just noting which one you've got there, and I'll come to that in a little while, because sometimes there's variations in the colours. Unfortunately, companies that make paint, they're not consistent across the board. So this is why I've got these little stickers here actually, because when I looked at one of these, it was saying transparent, when in fact I knew that if it's got a cadmium in front of the name, then cadmium is a type of metal. So that in itself is going to make the colour more opaque, less easy to see through than if it's transparent. So as I say, we'll come to that. We'll come to that shortly. So on here, I've drawn out a little box, and then I've started with the concentration of paint, lightening it with water. These other bits down here is I've done just a patch of water, and then I've dropped the colour in to see how good it is at spreading. In watercolour we do a lot of wet on wet. So it's this idea of, how good that paint is at actually spreading and sort of how quickly. So that's what those little patches of colour are. These other patches of colour here is where I've just popped in a circle of colour, and then while it's wet, I have just sprinkled in just a little bit of table salt. This is an effect that is used quite often in watercolour to get like a nice textured effect, and it's just dropping a little bit of table salt into the wet paint, and as you can see, it reacts differently. Let me just wipe that off. It reacts differently depending upon the colour and the type and the brand of paint that you've got. So this little patch down here, just turn it over so you can see that one. It helps me to see which colours react better to things like the salt. It could be the same with like granulation medium as well, granulation fluid, but we'll talk about that a little later. So yeah, so that's basically what I'm going to do. This session is about reds. I'll do another session on yellows, etc., throughout the months, hopefully then collecting a nice little book together that's a good central resource for us. So just to show you that in practice, let me just move that out of the way a second. So I've just got a little bit of watercolour paper here, and take just a round-headed brush. Doesn't really matter what brush it is, as long as it's suitable, for the size that you've got there. You don't have to wet this first. You can just go straight onto a dry surface. So I'm just going to take a cadmium red here. That's fine. And pop it in straight out of the tube or the pan. Okay, whichever you want. Make sure that top part is nice and concentrated, and then as you bring it down, just add some water to it. So you're starting to weaken the pigment in there, bringing it all the way down to the bottom, and you can see how it's starting to bleed there. Just going to pop a little bit more pigment into that top bit, creating a nice wash of colour as we come down into that water area down here. Okay, so I'm just going to let that dry off a little bit. So while I'm doing that, let's have a look at how well it spreads. So just a little patch of water on there. As always, make sure that you push that water into the surface of the paper. Don't let it sit on the top, because that'll only act to dilute your colour more than it should. And then picking up, again, just out of the tube or the pan, some of the colour, and let's just see how that spreads. Just a little dot in the centre. And although it's spread initially, it's not really an awful lot happening, is there, with that now? That's going to need more water to get it to spread. So in this case, with this being the cadmium red, it's an opaque colour. Opaque colours tend to be heavier in pigment, and therefore you can see it's not actually spreading very easily. The other thing that we're going to do then, like I said, with the second little swatch of colour down here, it doesn't matter, it can be whatever shape you want it to be. I don't know why I started with circles, but there you go. So just a little patch of colour, and into that I'm just going to sprinkle a little bit of salt. You don't need an awful lot of salt at all, so it's just a little bit in my hand there, and I'm going to pick up a little bit of it, just a pinch, and then gently just sprinkle it into the wet paint. Okay, now it does take a little time for that to react. What's actually happening is that the paint is being absorbed into each little grain of salt, and it's removing the colour from underneath that grain of salt, giving you the texture. So as I say, this is normal table salt, but you can use rock salt as well for larger speckles, if you like. So just try and, let me just move that out of the way a second there and pop that back just while that's drying on there. So you can see here that under each grain of salt, the colour has been lifted, creating this nice speckled effect. Okay, it's not happened so well in that one nor that one, but it has happened quite nicely in a couple of places on here. Right, so that's what's actually physically happening with that salt, that granule of salt. The colour underneath is being absorbed into it. So that's why you need to leave this to dry before you actually rub that salt off. If you rub it off now, there'll be nothing there. You know, you just need to let it settle, and then when it's completely dry, you can just rub the salt off. If your paint is too wet, then you can sort of over flood the little granules of salt, and again, you don't get the effect. So, you know, make sure that it's wet but not flooded, and then just a little gentle sprinkle of the salt, leave it, and you should get a nice textured effect. Okay, so we'll see how that reacts. As we have done with the acrylic colour samples, once we have seen what they're like as their pure colour and what they're like when we start to add, in acrylic's case, white into it to make it lighter, we've used those samples of colours in a little study. And that's one of the things that I'm going to show you today. Just move this across. Okay, you can see that all right there. So this little study here, I have given you a template for this actually in the attachments if you wanted to use a template. But what I've done is I've used two of the colours in here, the two cadmiums. There was a cadmium light and a cadmium deep. And then in this one here, I've used a couple of the slightly more cooler reds, the alizarin crimson, and what was the other one? A madder lake, to create these little poppies. So this is always a sort of a good exercise to do, is just, you know, once you start learning about colour, and understanding, you know, the mixes that you can get from it, just try a little something. It doesn't have to be a major project, just to have something next to the colour swatches that show you how those colours react with each other and how they can build up into a little study for you. So in that case, I'm just going to repeat what I've done earlier with these so that you've got the actual finished little flower here, but you can also then see how it builds up into that. A few of you have mentioned that you've perhaps been a little bit heavy-handed with the colour, the watercolour, when you've used it. Now that might be if you've done acrylics or oils previously and you're just moving into watercolour, or you're not quite, you know, perhaps you've had some new watercolours and you've not really experimented with them very much. Different brands can have different strengths to them. So it's always good to have a little play with them first and find out what your paints do. So in this case here, I'm just going to wet the surface. I've got a little light pencil outline. Remember, when you're doing watercolour, you want any pencil work that you've got on there to be very light. So we're only using a HB or a B pencil to put the outline in. And there again, we are pushing that water into the surface. Okay, don't let it sit as a puddle. Okay, push it in. Remember, if some of your lines, your pencil lines are too dark, you can use a putty rubber to just gently take off a little bit of the graphite and make them a bit more ghost-like. Okay, I'm going to do the other one down here, just so that that water there is settling into the page. So not only is this a good little exercise in the colour focus section on learning about watercolour, the different colours of watercolour, but it's also a good opportunity to practice some watercolour skills. So as I say, I've just put water on there, and we're going to just pop on just a little bit of that first cadmium. It's a light cadmium, so it's edging more towards the orangey tones. Okay, just letting it bleed. So we're doing a contained version of wet on wet we've wet the surface and we're now putting on a little bit of wet paint, and the two are obviously merging. So we're not getting any hard lines on here. So you can see if you come back to this one, this background layer here, the lightest version here, would have been dry when I put this layer on because we've got a hard line. At the moment, I'm looking at just a softness of the layer of paint that I've got on there. So into that, I'm going to pop a little bit of the other cadmium. So in this one up here, I've used the cadmium light and then the cadmium deep. And just keeping it very, very light. There's not much paint on here at all at the moment. And that's really the process that you want to try and adopt when you're working with watercolour is, you know, start out light. Remember, your watercolours will dry a little bit lighter anyway. But you're after these background layers here of being very, very light. You can always add more. You can always add more colour. Much more, you know, it's much easier to add more colour than try and take it away. Although the lifting out technique that if you've watched any of the watercolour tutorials, the lifting out technique is really quite a useful little thing to use as well, you know, to sort of have in your toolbox, if you like. So again, with this one down here, combination of the two colours. You can always add a little bit of water or a damp brush to soften an edge. Okay, and you can see already that's lightening, isn't it, over there? And by having 2 or 3 little samples to work on, one can be settling, can be drying off while you're working on another one. Because we want this next layer here to have a little bit of an edge to it. So we're wanting that surface to be drier. You know, if I carry on putting paint on that now and more paint, while it's all still wet, those colours are going to bleed into each other. So we're wanting to let that settle, let that dry off a little bit before we go on again. Okay, and these bits, you know, we'll put these, you know, little green bits and little detail bits in after. It just helps to, you know, bring the painting to a close, really. Okay, so I'm going back now to that cad red light. Okay, a little bit of a stronger consistency this time. If I just show you my palette, I mean, I know I've got some in a pan over there, but I'm using actually a flat palette for this, and then I can sort of have a concentrated blob, if you want, there. But then as I add more water into it, I can sort of have this as a much weaker version. Okay, plus if I need to clean that area, I can just get a damp cloth and wipe it off. And then I've got a new clean area to work with. Okay, so just going again, got a sort of idea where my light's coming from. As you can see here, the light is coming from this top corner, but you can have your light wherever you want. If it's easier for you to have your light coming from the left, that's fine. I think mine's more habit more than anything else. Okay, so you can see now that I'm starting to get a harder edge. This is the way you're going to start to get these layers. Okay, also just using that lifting out technique just to give a little bit of variation in that centre bit there. You know, that seemed a little bit of a sort of flat area there. So just a little bit of lifting out. So that was a damp brush that I was able to let the paint that's on the surface absorb back up into the bristles and remove it from the surface. So when you're doing this, be aware. It's so important to be aware of what is happening, you know, with the brush, with the paint that you're leaving behind. You know, don't just think about it as colouring in. You know, look at what's happening with the paint. You know, how fast is it bleeding? Is it lifting well? How's it sort of reacting with the other colours that's on there? Let's go to that deep red now. Okay, so being aware of where my light is coming from, so having a much deeper tone now on this side. And also how much of the brush you're using. You know, sometimes you can be using the tip, and as I did there, I used more of the body of the brush. Okay, I'm going to pop in a little bit of that lighter red there. I'm not working from any particular photo here. It's not that I'm aiming to, you know, produce a finished study. This is all about learning about the colour, learning about what it will do. So I'm going to come back to there and just deepen that a little bit. Thinking about where that light is. I'm going to have a centre in this one here, so. And these are poppies that have got a relatively distinct edge. You may have seen, or you may prefer to have a looser approach to, you know, your painting, to poppies, to flowers, which is absolutely fine. You know, perhaps try doing them without the pencil marks, without those boundaries. Okay, so I'm just going to let that settle again there. See if we need to go deeper again once that starts drying off. So come back to this one. Okay, so I'm looking at using the body of the brush there. And it's so important to leave little flecks of light coming through. I read an article a few years ago that this guy was you know, teaching his students about watercolour. And he was saying about always try and leave, you know, about 50% of the previous layer coming through, which I can appreciate what he's saying there, and I agree with him, although I wouldn't worry too much about it being 50%. I think as long as there is a certain amount of the previous layer coming through, you should have a nice picture that builds up in layers. Okay, so there again, I'm just going to leave that. What I might do again, just while that is settling there, is just use a little bit of my green just to put these in context, really. So I'm not particularly worried too much about this green, but it'll put it in context of the picture. I think if you can see your picture grow, you know, sort of quite naturally, you know, so adding these little bits in and around it will actually help you see. So that's gone a little bit heavy now, so let's just take a little bit of that out with a little bit of lifting out and increase the shadow on that side. Okay, so you can see just complementing that red that we're putting in there, just a little touch of those greens. And if it does bleed in, that's fine. You know, most flowers you'll find will have that little bit of a bleed into the stem. We can even push a little bit of the red that way if you wanted to. So while those bits are drying off, I'm going to then look at the colder reds on this side. So the process is exactly the same. I'm going to wet the area. You can draw whatever flowers you want, actually. You don't have to use the template that I've provided, but if it helps you, I'd rather you be focusing on the colours, the colour mixing and the application of the colours than the drawing side of things at the moment. So into that one, as I say, we're going to add in, it was the carmine, wasn't it, I think? Yeah, it was the, let me just check, sorry. Alizarin Crimson, sorry, and the Madder Lake. All right, so the Alizarin Crimson, this is the slightly colder version. Okay, so again, keep it light. We want it really nice and light to start. Right, so this is your colder red. This is edging more towards the blues on your colour wheel, whereas the warmer red is heading more towards your yellows and oranges on the colour wheel. Okay, so I haven't painted it all in. I've left little bits of that paper coming through. If I want more light coming from this side, I can let that paint suck up into the brush and do a little bit of lifting out. And then I'm going to use that Madder Lake, aren't I, which is the deeper version. Okay, just test that out. Yeah, that's okay. And think about where those more shadowy tones might be. And those are going to be on the opposite side, aren't they, to where the light's coming from, down here underneath. Perhaps a little bit as we go down into the centre of that flower. Okay, just teasing it out. So there's a lot of the time I'm not fiddling with the brush. You know, you can see I'm quite gentle with the brush. I'm just dabbing the brush into the colour, into the water or into the layer of colour, so that the paint goes where it wants to go. If I want it to sort of go a bit more in a particular direction, then I'll tease it. Okay, I'll just encourage it to go a little further. You know, I'm not being too heavy-handed. I'm not sort of pushing that paint around too much with my brush. It's just the tip of the brush. As I say, you can always add more. It's much easier to add, you know, sort of more to it. I've got a little blob there, haven't I? Let's suck that back up. And there. Okay, all right. So there again, that's starting to settle. I'm going to have the Alizarin Crimson now just a little bit stronger. Okay, so let's put that into here. It's still a little bit wet actually at the moment, this one is. Should have perhaps done another flower there to give me another one to work to on that. If you can, try and avoid using a hairdryer to dry layers if you're using sort of wet on wet. A hairdryer will actually sort of stop the paint in its flow, and you can start to get hard edges where you don't want them. So you do have to have a little bit more patience with your watercolour, you know, to let it dry as naturally as you can. Let's just have a little bit more of the Alizarin Crimson. As I say, it's important to start to get an awareness of which colours are opaque and which are transparent. There's a freshness. I mean, I don't know whether you can tell here with even just these two little samples. The cadmiums, there's not as much light coming through the cadmium colours as there is when we're looking at this alizarin crimson and madder lake. We've got a lovely lightness, you know, there's the paper tone, that lightness of the paper is actually coming through here. Whereas, you know, we've sort of lost a little bit of that freshness with these colours, which is why I say I tend to personally like to go down, wherever possible, a transparent paint route rather than an opaque one. I'm going to pop in a little bit of that base colour of the green underneath there. Okay, so I think that's actually settling a little bit more now, so I can go back in with that Madder Lake and put in some of these really nice strong, it can go even stronger. So this is literally coming just straight out of the pan now. A little bit more. And while that's wet, I can just drop more paint into that and make it a lot more concentrated. So say just two colours are in these flowers. Okay, so two of the cold reds and two of the warm reds. It's a little bit of a hard line there. I'm just going to soften that and bring some water into that. In fact, I'm just going to lift that light bit out there and I'm going to go the other side of it, I think, with some dark. Just adding water into that now. See how that's bleeding nicely now. And it's creating me an edge on this inner petal. So, you know, experiment. When it's in a little sketchbook like this, it doesn't feel as precious. So, you know, it gives you the freedom to play. And as I've said previously, you know, when you make mistakes, that's when, you know, the majority of learning takes place. So that still needs to be really quite strong. Just make sure I'm that's better. Really loading that brush up and that down, that bottom bit down there. And just tease it up a little bit with a bit of water. Okay, and bring that down into there. Okay, so you can see there how those colours work. Let's lift that out. I'm just going to pop in a little bit of centre bit to this one now that has dried. Okay, helps to give just a little bit of focus to that. That's just, that's an ivory black, I think that one is. But I'm just going to lift a little bit out of that so it gives me a different tone in there as well. So it's not just a flat black on its own. In there, and the same in this one. Don't try and be too precious with it or too perfect. As I say, it's really only for contrast. And again, lift out a little bit so we have a variation in the tone. I think what I do want with this one is I want a sort of a deeper tone of the, it was the, what was it? Oh, that's right. It's that cad, wasn't it? Cadmium deep. Just a little bit heavier underneath there. As I say, as it dries, you'll be able to tell if you need to sort of go in again to create a deepness. That's why it's a good idea to have, you know, 2 or 3 on the go. And I think we're going to go again. That's better. Okay. All right, so that's your little sample there. A little study showing how those colours, sorry if I just bring that back, how those colours there have been used in our poppies. And in the same way now, we've got our cold reds going into pinks. So the carmine is verging on the edge of like a crimson, but, you know, heading more towards a pink. Permanent rose is a lovely colour. That's a nice sort of, you know, basic pink colour. And then we start to go into magentas and purples. But it's all still within that realm. Doing the same thing here again, letting, you know, a little bit of a water patch, drop the paint in to see how it spreads. And then again, a little patch of paint and drop some salt in. Now you might want to know why these lines are in here. Once that paint is dry, and I can actually move back to my little sample now here. Sorry, there's a lot of moving about of things today, isn't there? So go back to this little sample, and with a flat-headed brush, in fact I'm going to turn it around that way, with a flat-headed brush, I'm going to lift the colour. As I say, this has dried, but you should still be able to lift some colour out, and it will be a reference for you as to which colours lift out well and which remain stained underneath. Okay, so that's lifted out relatively well there, but that's what that line is it actually sort of helps you to see and have a reference. I just moved back to my book. Has a reference of which colours actually you know, lift out well, and it's normally the transparent colours that tend to lift out better than the opaque ones on there. So on this next section, I have used just some little sweet peas, and again I have given you a template to work from for that. And again, I'm using two of the more pinker tones there. So that was the permanent rose there, and what was the other one? Oh, the carmine. And then in this, more towards the magenta and that purple lake. But doing exactly the same thing as we've just done with that one, is that sort of learning about those layering up, staying light to start with. So important to stay light with your watercolours. Very, very little colour to start with, and then build it up to much more concentrated versions of paint towards the end. So we'll perhaps do that little sample at some point there. But the other thing I want to show you here, I just pop a little tube of paint in there so my page doesn't close on it. Yeah, you don't have to do this for every colour, but while you're learning about watercolour paint, learning about the colours that you've actually got, it's worth doing a little bit of colour mixing and referencing it. As I say, it doesn't have to be every colour, but, you know, choose a few colours. Here, what I've done is I've used the cadmium red deep, so just pop yourself a little reminder at the top. So cadmium red deep has gone into each one of these top boxes, and then at the bottom I've put in here, there's a yellow, a green and a blue. The yellow is a cadmium yellow, that's an opaque colour. Then this one is sap green, which is transparent, and the ultramarine here, which is also transparent. Now when I did this first one, I've got 10 boxes. Why I've got 10 boxes I don't know, but I just picked a number out of the air really. And I have made a graduation of tone right the way through to the yellow at the bottom here. Now this central section here, there's hardly any difference at all. So that basically tells me that 10 boxes was too much. So I've taken sort of 2 out really, so that, you know, you're not sort of mixing paint forever. But into the cadmium red deep there, I started to add in a tiny little bit of the colour at the bottom. So into this one went a tiny little amount of the sap green, add a bit more of the sap green in, add a bit more of the sap green in. So that gives me a nice, starting to get a nice range of tones there, moving towards this sap green. Rather than continue to add in more sap green and more sap green, that red has already muddied the waters, if you like. I'm never going to get from that to that. So I take that so far, and then I start with the sap green and I add a little bit of the red into it. So I start off with my sap green, add a tiny bit of the red, a little bit more of the red, and a little bit more of the red. Now what that helps us to see is that how that red is affected by green and how that green is affected by red. So there's a bias, there's the ratio of paint differs. And you can start to see this as we look across the page now. You know, particularly when we look back sort of down here at these ones where we've got the permanent rose. These are all still relatively pinky on here, but obviously when we add it the other way, so the larger ratio of paint is the sap green here, and we start to add bits of the permanent rose in, we've still got very much a sort of green bias because the green is the majority of the colour. So I know this might sound a little bit complicated, and I'm trying not to make it complicated for you, because if it's complicated, you won't do it. Yeah, I think there's a benefit for you to play with colour, and it can be organised like this, or it can just be little swatches of colour on a page. But I think it is important for you to just try and get to understand the colours that you use in the colours that you've got in your art box. So as I say, I've just taken the cadmium red and I've taken the permanent rose, and then I've added into these 3 colours. With the cadmium yellow being opaque and the cadmium red being opaque, you can see that the colour mixes here are really quite strong. That's because there's not a lot of light coming through from the paper. It's almost like having sunblock in the paint. It stops that sort of light coming through, you know, of the sun. As we move across to more transparent colours like the permanent rose here, and we're starting to mix that with an ultramarine, which I think is transparent as well. I will double check that, but I'm sure ultra is transparent. You can actually see there's much nicer lightness to those colour mixes. There's much more transparency of that paper coming through. Even on this one, really, where we've added in a little bit of the cad yellow. The cad yellow is opaque, but because majority of the paint mix in these ones is the permanent rose, you're still getting quite a nice lightness to those colours, almost like, I suppose, a semi-opaque. But to have these little swatches around so that you can see how many different shades you can get just from 2 colours, so you've got your red and your green, your red and your blue, you can get a range of tones there. For anybody that has watched any of the, I think like the lavender lesson and the iris lesson, I've spoken about if you haven't got a violet or a purple that you can make purples and lilacs. You can see here that this warm red, all right, so this cadmium red, this warm red, which as I said is closer to your oranges and your yellows, when we start to add ultramarine into that to create a purple, these purpley tones are a little bit on the muddy side. And that's because you're using a warm red you're using that warm red that got these tones in, and so it's creating a bit more of a muddy, warmer tone to the purples and the lilacs. When we use something which is like here, your permanent rose, which is a much more on the colder side, you know, of the reds, and we add the ultramarine into it, we get a much nicer variation of lilacs and purples here than we have on here. You know, these are quite muddy, these are much lighter and nicer. So, you know, that's sort of an important thing to remember is when you're making up your purples and violets is to always use a red that's more on the cold side towards the pinks. Okay, so let me just show you a little example of that, and then we'll perhaps do just one of those freesias, not freesias, were they? Sweet peas on there. Okay, so let's take that mix actually of that permanent rose and the ultramarine. I've just done, in fact I can rub that salt off now, that's dried. Yeah, so you can see there it's started to actually pick up the paint and create, you know, a nice little texture. Great for backgrounds actually, that is. Sorry, I was talking about this box over here, wasn't I? I've just drawn out 8 little boxes, but you don't have to draw this out if you don't want to. You can literally just put some, you know, paintbrush marks. Depends on how, you know, sort of organised you want to be with it. So I'm just taking the permanent rose. Not really worried too much about staying in the lines. It's more about the understanding and the process rather than being too neat on here. Then I'm going to take that ultramarine. A little bit more water with that. So these are the two colours, top and bottom of this row here, this column. These are the two colours that I'm going to mix. Okay, so into that permanent rose, I'm going to add a tiny little touch of the ultra. And you can see that's started to deepen it. Okay, a little bit more of the ultra. And it's starting to go more towards those violets, aren't we? And a little bit more. Touch more. Okay, so I've basically done 3 coming from the permanent rose. Now I'm going to go down to the ultra down here. Try and bring that a little bit closer, I think, so you can see what I'm doing with the mixing. Okay, so that's just the ultra on its own. And I'm just going to pick up a little bit of the permanent rose. Okay, so it's just starting to move that ultra into the purple and violet ranges. A little bit more. So the ratio of paint is stronger with the blues down here, but stronger with the pink and permanent rose at the top. And then really we're just looking for a tone that's going to go in the middle of these two. This is where it gets, you know, really quite close. Okay, so there's not much difference at all between those two. All right, but that took, you know, a minute to do. It's well worth doing these little, you know, practices, even if it's only, you know, a couple of weeks. And if you've got them in a little sketchbook, it means then that you've got them to refer back to whenever you need. So if I just come back now and we'll have a little look at giving you a bit of a demonstration on these sweet peas here. Okay, exactly the same way as we did before with the poppies. We're going to add the water in, push that water into the surface. Okay, on there. So we're going to start with that permanent rose while I've got it mixed. All right, so we're just going to drop that in. Let it bleed. These are your light layers. These are the things right at the back. Lift out if you want to. Just roll your brush through it, lifting any paint out. And always remember to wipe that on a cloth so you get rid of it. Right, so there again we are pushing that water into the surface. And this time I think we'll use a little bit of the magenta, which we've used over here. You can see that magenta is a bit more towards the lilac purple side. Again, let's lift out a little bit so we get a softness to those bleeds. And then we're going to add in a little bit of carmine into this. That's quite strong there, isn't it? Picked up a bit too much at that stage, so let's just get it to bleed out. A little bit of wet on wet there. So don't worry if you go into too heavy. You know, you can lift out or add water to it and it'll soften it. And then into the magenta here, we're going to add a little bit of purple lake. Always make sure if you're coming in with your darker colour that you go to the more shadowy areas. So it doesn't matter then if you did like I did there and went on too heavy too soon. Okay, just a little bit of lifting out again. So it's a combination, adding in those light tones. While those two are drying off a bit, I might as well just put this one in. You know, we're adding in those light tones of watercolour. And then building the layers up. Always making sure that you're leaving a little bit of the previous layer coming through. So this is the, oops, there we go, it's better. This is the permanent rose, the lightest one we've got. Lift a little bit out. Try and be a bit more gentle with that carmine this time. That's better. Okay, get it to bleed. You see I went into the area where I know it's going to be darkest, down here. And then it wouldn't have mattered if I'd have gone on too heavy. Or you can, of course, just test it on a spare bit of paper. Okay, so we're starting to get a feel for that one there. That's looking a little bit on the flat side there, so I'm just going to lift a little bit out in there. Let's create a little bit more interest. And then our purple lake, I think, can go. See how strong that can be. And again, that'll dry lighter than this. I think I took about 2 or 3 different attempts to actually get it nice and dark in there. What's that one? That was the carmine, isn't it? Getting confused now with my all these reds. Okay, so I'm going to go a little bit into that centre there. So using the body of the brush at times creates some interest. Can go back to this one now because that one's settled a little. Okay, so it's going to be quite dark underneath here. Bit of a hard edge, so I'm just going to soften that just with a little bit of water. So if you think about the exercise that we did when we looked at brushes and the different marks we can get with brushes, we spoke about then, didn't we, whether we use the tip or we use the body of the brush to create a mark. So I'm hoping you can sort of see how that translates now into actual practice. Okay, so I'm going back over to this one now. Really quite strong in terms of see how rich that paint can be. That's better. And the magenta. Let's bring a little bit of that magenta into that top bit. And sometimes you might get a brush mark that you really quite like, and if that's the case, just leave it, don't fiddle with it. Just going to lift a little bit out of there. So all the time you're playing between light and shade. Picking up quite a bit of that purple lake now, just dropping that in. And back to my carmine. I mean, obviously I'm doing, 2 variations here for you, but, you can just concentrate on one pairing if you want, rather than get confused with your colour. And there again, just to help these to settle into the picture, we're just going to add a little bit of greenery to it. And once again, don't worry if it bleeds into the base of your flower. Tend to get with these sweet peas is some like little curly bits, don't you, sort of coming off on there. And the sap green. Everything, it doesn't matter how small it is, will have a contrasting colour to make it look 3-dimensional. There's always a light and a dark. Okay, so I'm going to leave it there, I think. And it's a lot of information to take in one session. So perhaps, just watch this little video a couple of times. Obviously, as I go through the other colours now with the watercolour part of colour section of colour focus, then some of the information will be repeated anyway. And obviously, like anything, the more we practice, the more repetition we do, the more it sort of sinks in, and we start to understand then the actual physical nature of the watercolour and how to use it. So I'm hoping that some of the information there might help those of you that have perhaps been a little bit heavy-handed initially with some of the exercises so far. And, you know, as I say, please do investigate your colours and try to get a better understanding of them. Information, as always, is in the attachments for you to download or print out. And I'll see you again soon. Bye for now.